Hello class, kindly stop sharing videos. Kindly stop sharing your screen because the lecturer is just logging in right now. For those sharing, Dennis, nakuona na wenzako nawaona. Naongea na mwingine anashare nini yake ya nyumba, ndio? You know, we can easily track you from here, and then whatever happens to you, don't blame anyone. You are supposed to log into class and then wait for the lecturer, just the same way you do for physical classes. So anyone who is trying to share video, anyone who is trying to share the screen, just know that that is illegal. I don't blame anyone for anything that might happen to you. The lecturer is just logging in and is almost starting the class.
Stop making noise and be serious. Concentrate. A good job, then.
What you're doing right now.
Bundles zinaisha.
We are not getting you.
Bundles zinaisha. Kwani leka kwa wapi?
Bundles zinaisha.
Bana lek bana, ingia bana. Watu.
Ni mute.
Hasira inanishika. Bwana.
Hello. Hello, students.
Hello.
Yes, we are hearing you, sir.
Okay, thank you. And sorry for
We are hearing you, sir.
Hello.
So we are
Take it
to
easy.
begin our
Lecturer
class.
will be there in 2 hours time.
Late bado zinaisha bwana.
Who is this? Is it?
Lake
Hello?
bundles zina
Yes, but I'm on board. So sorry
Be
for that
humbled.
delay, but I want us to begin our class. And today we are going to look at the European colonization of Africa. In our previous lesson, we learned about the nation states in Africa. So in our previous lesson, we learned about nation states in Africa. And we were able to compare pre-colonial nations, nation states in Africa. And I gave way forward on about our today's lesson, which is about European colonization of Africa. And I gave you a takeaway assignment to look at Walter Rodney's work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. I wish to get from the class, if you are able to access that document, the work piece of Walter Rodney on European colonization of Africa. Maybe somebody to just highlight some of the issues raised by Walter Rodney on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So you can unmute and then speak up, please. You're welcome. Hello?
hello.
Yes, you're welcome. Say something about Walter Rodney's views on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Hello, class. Students on board?
Yes, we are on board.
Yes,
We are getting clear from even Nairobi.
Thank you. And I gave you a takeaway assignment on Walter Rodney's work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So I wish to get the feedback on that. Hello?
Hello.
Yes.
Can I try for my research? Try to check on the some reasons on how Walter Rodney and how European countries, how European underdeveloped Africa. We have some points, highlights points that maybe I found them out. So the first one was exploitative trade, whereby European powers engaged in slave trade, which forcibly took millions of Africans from their homeland, thus resulting in the loss of productive labor. Then another one, we had resource extractions, whereby the European colonial powers exploited African vast nature resources such as minerals and timber with a little regard for environmental sustainability. Then another one, we had land grabbing and dispossession, whereby the European colonial powers frequently confiscated valuable land from local communities, undermining traditional agricultural practices. Then another one, we had infrastructure development, where the infrastructure developed during colonial rule served the interest of the colonizers, focusing on the transportation routes to facilitate resource extraction and trade. Then we had export-oriented economies, whereby colonies were structured to produce cash crops for export to Europe and agriculture. We had education and cultural education, whereby the European education system and cultural undermined African. Then another one have exploitation of labor, whereby African was subjected to harsh labor condition with minimal wage and rights. So this exploitation led to economic disparities and income inequality, as wealth generated from African labor benefited the colonial powers only. Then we had the division and conflicts, whereby the colonial powers created borders dividing ethnic groups and regions without regard of local realities. So this led to ethnic tension, conflicts, and instability that persist in post-colonial Africa. So those were the points that I was able to find out about Walter Rodney.
Yeah, well done, well done. That's a very good summary of Walter Rodney's work on arguments on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Maybe if we can get another person, that was good work done by our colleague there who has just presented. And you know, Walter Rodney was from Guyana. He was a Guyanese. Maybe somebody else who has maybe some other points just to beef up whatever we have received.
Hello.
Yes, you're welcome. And you'll be the final person.
According to him, Europeans brings about cultural disruption, whereby they impose cultural norms that distracted African societies. Second point, they bring about debt and economic dependency, whereby some African nations accumulated significant debt. Third point, Europeans bring about imposition of artificial borders, whereby Europeans colonial drew arbitrary borders without regard to cultural boundaries.
Well done, well done. And that one sums up the work of Walter Rodney on European, on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And that means that most of you worked on the assignment, because that's exactly what that's exactly the arguments of how Europe underdeveloped Africa, according to Walter Rodney. But class, it's important for us to note that that the underdevelopment debate in Africa is not just merely, you cannot solely blame Europe for the underdevelopment of Africa, because to some extent, after the attainment of independence, that is why maybe in our next session, we shall be looking at nationalism in Africa and the failure of nationalism. You will realize that that the failure of nationalism in Africa has really contributed to the underdevelopment debate in Africa. And basically, therefore, we are saying that as much as we blame Europe for the underdevelopments in Africa, it's important to come to a realization that Africans, to some extent, participated in participated in the underdevelopment of Africa. As we shall also highlight some of the key points, majorly when we shall be looking at the next topic on nationalism and failure of nationalism in Africa. And we shall be looking at examples of the failed states in Africa. And you'll discover that the underdevelopment debate in Africa cannot wholly, therefore, be blamed on the European colonization of Africa. And therefore, class, today, we are going to look at European colonization of Africa, and from that, we shall be able to look at the impact of European colonization. That is where we shall get some of the points that Walter Rodney points out on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. So we shall also be able to look at those the impacts as highlighted by Walter Rodney, and therefore, to start with, it's important to look at the motivations. What really was the reason as to why the Europeans developed interest in the colonization of Africa? And you realize that in the 19th century, the mid-19th century, most of these European countries had developed interest in colonizing different parts of Africa. And this only was anchored on what we call the Industrial Revolution that had taken place in Europe. In history, we are told that by 1820, Britain had realized the industrial takeoff that is in Europe. That industrialization had begun, and machines had, industries had been established, and the use of machines, therefore, the use of machines replaced human labor, and this called for now the decline of slave trade, which was majorly the major factor, the major trade that used to take place. And for the historians on board, they know that we had what we call the triangular trade. This was the trade that took place between Europe, Africa, and America. If you can be able to draw that triangle, you realize that from Europe up there to Africa, then to America, then to Europe, it forms a triangle. And therefore, by 1820, Britain had attained what we call industrial takeoff. And for that matter, these industries required raw materials. By 1850, we are told France had also taken industrial takeoff, had also realized the Industrial Revolution. And by 1870, Germany also joined the race. And you realize that this competition that existed in Europe, it is what necessitated now the European colonization of Africa. Therefore, just to lay the background, we are saying that there are these motivations, there are these reasons that made European countries to come to Africa, and thereby claiming different parts. By then, they were referred to as spheres of influence. Later on, after what we call the Berlin conferences, we shall learn later, these spheres of influence later on changed to what we refer to as the colonies. And therefore, what happened when these European countries realized industrialization was that they began to compete, that is in Europe. Initially, it was just Britain alone. And therefore, Britain really enjoyed some of the resources that existed in Europe. And remember, by then, they had colonized the Americas. Britain colonized America from 1775 to 1783. That is when America attained independence. And therefore, we are saying that Britain really enjoyed the raw materials in Europe and also in America. But we are seeing some other European countries coming on board. And good examples we are giving are the French, then the Germans by 1870. And you realize that with the coming on board of these other countries having realized industrial takeoff, there came a period of scrambling for the raw materials. And therefore, this country endeavored to look for other sources of raw materials. And therefore, you realize that the backbone to the European colonization of Africa, the major reason was the industrial takeoff in Europe. But that was not just the major reason, as we shall also classify them into socio-political and economic reasons later on. So we are saying that because of this need for raw materials, these European nations rushed to Africa. They rushed to Africa to acquire different parts to what we refer to as the spheres of influence. There was no order. Any European country that developed interest in Africa, they rushed to different parts of Africa. And because of this rush that happened, it brought about collision. Now, the rush for African countries to acquire different parts of Africa with the major reason of acquiring the raw materials is what led to what we call a process called the scramble. Now, to scramble means it is to engage in a hasty struggle in order to obtain something desired also by others. And therefore, we are saying that these European countries scrambled for Africa. That hasty rush, hasty struggle, just like when you have dogs in the home and throw to them a bone. What happens is that they rush so fast because it's just one bone and there are several dogs. So what happens is the first come will take the bone. So Africa was like that bone, and European countries, European colonial masters were like the dogs. So they were rushing to get the bone, and that is Africa. So that kind of rush, that kind of struggle to get different parts of Africa and claim them as spheres of influence is what we refer to as the scramble for Africa. So the scramble, and this scramble therefore led to collision. We had different European countries developing interest in one area. Hello? Hello, students, can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Not that you are getting
Hello, thank you. So we can proceed. And therefore we are saying that this rush for African to acquire different parts of Africa is what we refer to as the scramble. And because of this scrambling, there is one European known as, that was the chancellor for German, known as Otto von Bismarck, in 1884, 1885. That is 1884. Called for a meeting. He looked at the rush of these European countries to Africa to attain different parts of Africa. And he therefore decided that call for a meeting. The major reason for calling this meeting was to enable these European countries to come together and therefore agree on terms of sharing Africa. And this came to be known as what we call the Berlin Conference. So Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, called for a meeting in 1884 November. And the countries that had developed interest to colonize Africa included Britain, Germany itself, Spain, France, Italy, Belgium. They had developed interest in Africa. And therefore, when he called the meeting, these members who had developed interest to colonize Africa came to attend the meeting. This meeting came to be known as the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. The meeting itself began in November 1884, and it extended up to 1885 February. And therefore, we are saying that these countries, that the European countries that came, they were chaired by Otto von Bismarck. And the major reason was, maybe just give us 1 minute. So we can proceed, class. Thank you. There was a technical hitch. We were trying to fix it this side, but then we can continue. So we are saying that this meeting, which was called by Otto von Bismarck, 1884, it took place 1884 from November to 1885, necessitated or it enabled the European countries, therefore, to share this continent. They sat around the table, and as they sat around the table, there was this bread that was at the center. This bread was Africa. So they began sharing themselves, amongst themselves, this continent called Africa. And what enabled them to share was the major reason their motivations, because again, they claimed different parts of Africa with the reasons. As we shall be looking at the motivation, you realize that, for example, the British colonized, or Britain colonized Egypt, and Egypt, the colonization of Egypt is what necessitated the colonization of Kenya, Uganda, Sudan, and we shall give reasons as to why it happened so. So the sitting around the table, the agreement, as we shall be looking at the terms of the treaty, is what led to what we call partitioning of Africa. So we have looked at two very important terms here, terminologies, and the first one was scramble or scrambling. This was a haste rush or struggle in order to obtain different parts of Africa. But then it is the scramble that led to what we call now the partition of Africa. And the partition of Africa is the orderly way. It's just a process of dividing and acquiring parts of Africa. And this was necessitated through what we call the Berlin Conference that was called by Otto von, the Chancellor of German, Otto von Bismarck. So the opposite of scramble is partition, because again, now these people, they came to an agreement, and therefore they shared in an orderly manner this bread known as Africa among us themselves. Plus, therefore, it's important to look at these motivations. I will just highlight them in this class today, but you will get comprehensive notes, which you will still refer to. I have classified them into the following. We are looking at the motivations of European colonization of Africa, and they can be classified. If you do Google search, you'll find some of them that they classify them as social, others political, others economic, and then of course what we call the pull factors. Amongst all this, we can mention the Bismarck. So the motivations are the reasons for European colonization of Africa. At times you ask students to give you the motivations, they fail. They only know the reasons. So I want to state here categorically that when you talk about the motivation of European colonization of Africa, we are referring to the reasons behind the colonization of Africa by the Europeans. And some of them include the following. One is the Bismarck and the rise of German. Number two is the Egyptian question. Number three is the French activities in Congo and West Africa. Number four is religion and missionary forces. We have also what we call the economic factors, as we shall highlight them. We have racism and strange attitudes as another factor. Nationalism and national prestige is another factor. Individual initiatives. And then we had what we call the Berlin Conference. Class, it is important for us to look at, first of all, look at what we call the economic factors, because it is what led to European colonization. The major reason that led to European colonization of Africa was the economic factors. And under the economic factor, we highlight them as the following. Roman 1, the search for raw materials. Roman 2, the search for market for the finished goods. Roman 3, we look at search for areas of reinvestment. And Roman 4, we look at the protection of European investments in Africa. So under economic factors, we have listed about 4 factors that made the Europeans to develop interest to colonize Africa. And we have mentioned, we begin with the Roman 1 under the economic factors. 1 is the need for raw materials. In my background, in my introduction, when I began teaching this topic, I mentioned about the industrial revolution or the industrial takeoff in Europe, that we had these European countries that had realized industrial revolution. And we mentioned that the first one was Britain, followed by the France, followed by Germany, and the rest of other European countries followed suit. So what happened is the need for more raw materials. And because of this need for raw materials, these European countries were not just satisfied by what was there in Europe. They endeavored to come to Africa to acquire. Now, one of the reasons, or what exposed the minerals, the rich resources that existed in Africa, were the works of the missionaries, the traders, and the explorers. Remember, before the coming in of the colonialists, we had the explorers, and you know them, you can mention them. Yes, the people like Redman, David Livingstone, and some of them came as explorers and others came as missionaries. We had people like, of course, Ludwig Krapf. So they came, traversed the continent, and in so doing, they realized that in Africa, there were so many resources that had not been exploited. And they used to write letters or give reports back to their motherland, the countries that sent them. And they were telling them, Africa is a continent full of resources that have not been exploited. And because of this report that they received, the colonialists therefore developed interest. They developed interest to colonize Africa. And therefore we are saying that because of these reports, which were sent to them by the explorers, by the missionaries, it made these guys to develop that interest. Of course, again, we had a country like the French, who developed the France, that is France, who had come to Africa earlier, before even colonization took place. And whatever they found in Africa, the reports they acquired showed that Africa was a rich continent with the resources that had not been exploited. And therefore, because of the industrial takeoff in Europe, these Europeans came to Africa to take the resources. These resources included cotton, silk, rubber, vegetable oils, timber, minerals like gold, like copper, name them. Those were the major, the search for raw material was the major reason for European colonization of Africa. And therefore, apart from this, now, what happened when minerals or these raw materials were acquired in Africa? These raw materials were shipped, therefore, back to Europe. In Europe, the industries were there in place. So the raw materials were processed. And after processing, there was need to find an extra market for these finished goods, not just in Europe. Europe could not, most of them could not utilize all these resources, all these products. And therefore, and you realize that by 1870 or by end of the 18th century, most European countries had attained had realized industrial revolution. And therefore, each country in Europe was producing. So there was the need again now, apart from looking for these raw materials, there was the need now to get market for the raw materials, for the finished goods. And therefore, there was available and ready market in Africa. So these people came to Africa to look for market. So that is another second factor under the economic factor. Apart from that, so when they did this business, they acquired raw materials, processed them, brought and sold them in Africa. So they acquired a lot of money. There was surplus, accumulation of surplus wealth from the trade. So what happened was now to look for areas for reinvestment. So they wanted now to reinvest. And Africa offered that virgin land for investment. So they developed, another motivation is that they now developed interest in Africa because it provided areas for investment or reinvestment after having acquired what we call the surplus wealth. So they began investing, building roads, building, of course, businesses in Africa. So what followed after the establishment of these businesses or European activities in Africa, the other one, which is Roman number 4, was now to protect these businesses in Africa. And therefore that was under economic factor. That one was Roman number 4 that necessitated them to come to colonize Africa. So basically that is what we refer to as the economic factors. Another factor is what we refer to, another group of factors is what we refer to as the social factors. I'm trying just to spot them where they are, the social factors. And when you talk about the social factors class, we are talking about it matters of religion, it matters civilization, and matters that is religion, civilization, and the excess population that existed in Europe. So under the social factors, we look at the following factors. One is on matters of religion. 2, we look at settlement of resettlement of excess population in Europe. Number 3, we look at the need to stop slave trade. So under the social factors, 1 is religion. These people, of these Europeans, believed that they had a superior religion, and this religion was Christianity. So they came to Africa. This was another pool of factors, of course, we are mentioning under social factors, the religion aspect. These people believed that their religion was superior. And what the Africans practiced, the so-called traditional African religion, to them was backward and did not have the concept of God in it. And therefore, they came to Africa to spread Christianity. And in so doing, they sent the missionaries. When these missionaries came, we are saying, these colonialists followed after to protect them and to ensure that they are preaching the gospel and therefore getting more converts in Africa. Just on matters religion, there was also the need to counter the spread of Islam. Remember, the Muslims had also set foot in Africa, and therefore the Europeans, and most of them were Christians, endeavored to counter the spread of Islam in Africa. Apart from that, the next or the other social factor that we just mentioning is the need to resettle excess population in Europe, in Africa. With the industrial takeoff in Europe, there was higher output. Production was on another level. And therefore, what happened when people produce a lot is that in terms of production, people, the population multiplied in Europe. And for that matter, the Europeans, therefore, when they came to Africa, and of course, when they received reports from these explorers and missionaries, these reports indicated that there was large tracts of land in Africa that had not been occupied. And therefore, these Europeans, what they did was to send their excess population to fill up these tracts of land that had not been occupied in Africa. Under the same, another social factor is what we refer to as the need to stop slave trade. And this one was done so by the reports that were done by David Livingstone when he traversed the Central Africa to South Africa. he came across this kind of trade that existed. And according to him, slave trade was inhuman. And therefore what he did was he sent the message to his own people and therefore requested them to come to Africa and help stop slave trade. So that was another social factor that made the Europeans to come to Africa. But the last one under the social factor was the need to civilize the Africans. According to the Europeans had the notion that they possessed a superior kind of civilization, but the Africans were looked as people who were backward, people who were barbaric, people who had not received civilization. And therefore, at times they used to refer to it as upon the European burden to come to Africa to colonize the Africans. So to civilize the Africans. And that also was another factor under the social factor that made them to come to Africa to colonize them. Maybe just in a nutshell, I don't know if we are on board, all of us. Can you hear me? Am I too fast?
We are getting you, sir. Continue.
Thank you.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you. So we can proceed. Okay, thank you. So thank you, class. So far, we've looked at the economic and the social factors. We have also what we call the political factors. And these political factors come from what we refer to as, for example, the first one is there was something to do with the nationalism in Europe, the rise of nationalism in Europe. And therefore, we are saying that in Europe, there was the rise of general feeling of civilians that their nation should acquire overseas colonies for national prestige. And this came by the Germans, who began the feeling that they belong to a superior race that must be shown by acquiring colonies in Africa. So class, when we were learning about the pre-colonial Africa, one thing that we learned about this special race that was in German, that is the Aryans, we discovered that these people believed that they were a superior race. And therefore, there was this general feeling in Europe that countries in Europe were superior. And and this one led to what we refer to as the need to acquire colonies overseas. And a country in Europe by then was known to be superior by how many colonies they possessed. And that is why we are saying most of these European countries, when they came to Africa, or even to overseas, that is in Asia, they acquired so many colonies. One of the major reasons was according to them was that when you acquire many colonies, therefore you'll be known as, or you'll be regarded as a superior nation in the entire Europe. So there was this quest to acquire colonies overseas. And the acquisition of these colonies brought about what we call national prestige. A European country will be more prestigious by the many colonies they have acquired overseas. And this was another factor that led to European colonization of Africa. Racism and strange attitudes was another factor. And this is what led to also European colonization of Africa. The issue, when you talk about racism, we are talking about color. Yes, segregation based on color. And according to them, to the Europeans, they believed that the white color signified superiority, but the black color signified the inferior race in the world. And therefore, racism was another factor that made these people to come and therefore influence the backward, the inferior race that existed in Africa. So that was another reason that made them to come. And we are told that we have people like Doyle, who believe that to them, Africans were just mere grown-up children, a race that will only attain maturity of other men after they have been persuaded to stop worshipping hills, rivers, and of course, maligned spirits of their own dead. Now, according to these people, they believed that Africans were just mere grown-up children, but they had not attained the maturity. According to them, there is no way people can worship God in the hills, on the mountains, in the forest, along the rivers. And according to them, therefore, they felt there was a need to come and influence these people, bring about civilization to these Africans. Another factor, apart from that, we've talked of the rise of nationalism, we've talked of racism and the strange attitude, believing that the Europeans were superior. The reason was, it was just because of the industrial takeoff in Europe. And therefore they believed that because they had taken off in the industrial sector, they were a superior nation, better than Africans. And therefore there was the need to come and colonize Africa. Apart from this, we've just talked of the religion and mission factor, of course, under the social factors, where we are told that, of course, when the missionaries came to Africa, in one hand they had the flag, the Bible, and on the other hand they had the flag in their left hand. So in the right hand, they are preaching the gospel about Jesus. They were preaching about the need for these people to receive salvation and practice Christianity. But in the other hand, they had the flag. That was the nation that sent them, was behind them. So where they were accepted, they call upon the European countries to come and do what? And take over. In areas where we had these missionaries going into the interior and they were resisted, they used to call for protection from their home, from their mother countries that sent them. And when they came to provide protection to these missionaries, later on, they took over these areas as what? As their spheres of influence. Another reason is another factor is the Bismarck and the rise of Germany. Just in a nutshell, I know when those ones who are historians on board really enjoy this, because they have the history of German and the French. There was this factor known as Bismarck and the rise of German. Of course, I talked of Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck was the Chancellor of Germany. So what happened was, before the rise of German, we had Britain that had taken lead in industrial revolution, and what followed was France. So before the rise of German in 1870-71, these two countries dominated Europe, that is Britain and France. But later on, there was this country that came on board. This is German, led by Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck led the German to fight this war. This war was known as the Franco-Prussian War. The Franco-Prussian War took place in the year 1870 to 1871. And what happened during this war? German defeated the French. When the Germans defeated the French, they were able now to bring together the different states that existed that were part of German. Although they had not come together, they existed autonomously. But what happened when Germany defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-1871 was that now Bismarck consolidated all these states and brought them together to form one nation, a united nation known as German. So in the unification of German as a single nation made German to be a very powerful nation. And therefore this complicated the whole matter in Europe, because in Europe we had only these two countries that ruled, Britain and France. And because of this, the rise of German complicated the balance of power in Europe. And what happened was that the humiliation of the French did not just stop at being defeated in the war. The German under Otto von Bismarck took the most important provinces that belonged to France. This was Alsace and Lorraine. These two provinces were rich in coal. Coal was a very important mineral during the Industrial Revolution. So the taking of these two provinces that belonged to France, known as Alsace and Lorraine, really affected the French. And these two important provinces were rich in coal and also in iron. So these two were absorbed and they were declared part of the German nation. Because of this humiliation, again, the Germans, therefore, sought to find refuge elsewhere. And this is now what happened to the French. Apart from just taking Alsace and Lorraine, we are saying that the German accused the French for having caused the Franco-Prussian War. And because of this, they were to pay the Germans again, because of the reason of causing this war. Buildings were destroyed, people were killed during this war. So there was the need to pay what we call the reparation fee by the French, because they were accused to have caused the war. And this totaled up to what to 150 sterling pounds. That was a lot of money by then. So for the French to pay back the Germans, they sought resources overseas for them in order to pay. They were supposed to pay, I think, was within 15 years. But surprisingly, when the French developed interest in Africa, they came to Africa and acquired resources. And we are told in history, the French were able to repay this reparation fee within the 5 years. And this really astonished or surprised many European nations that had developed interest in Africa, like the Germans. The Germans expected that the French will not be able to repay that debt, over 150 sterling pounds. This was a lot of money. And therefore, the acquisition of resources in Africa by the French and the ability to repay within 5 years really raised the eyebrows of the European nations, who realized that there lies a lot of resources in Africa, and thereby developing interest to come to colonize Africa. So at times a question is usually asked, the impact of the Franco-Prussian War to the colonization of Africa. It is true that the Franco-Prussian to some extent led to the colonization of Africa, because one is that France was defeated and humiliated. It was supposed to pay back to the Germans, and therefore they came to Africa to acquire resources so that they can generate wealth to be able to repay the Germans. So that is it, was another reason. Another one was the Egyptian question class. And when you talk about the Egyptian question, in short, we are talking about the acquisition of Egypt by the British. And the British had developed interest in Africa, and apart from that, the Far East, that is in Asia. So what happened was, for them to find a shortcut, a short route to the Far East. Remember, the other way from Europe to Far East had been blocked by the Turks. The Turkish government or troops had blocked them to use the shortcut from Europe to the Far East. There was that route via the Middle East. That route had been blocked by the Turks or the Turkish government. And therefore, they had to find an alternative way. The only way to find an alternative route to the Far East and also colonize Africa was to acquire Egypt, because Egypt possessed what we call the Suez Canal, which had been built by the then king of Egypt. Although this king, in the quest to build this Suez Canal, he went into debt because he really squandered money. This was Hadef Ismail, who squandered money that they borrowed from these European nations to build the Suez Canal. In so doing, the French had developed already interest in Egypt. But when the British realized that they could not access the Far East, they developed also interest in Egypt, and therefore immediately came to Africa to acquire Egypt. So the British were able to overthrow the French in Egypt. What the French did after they were also humiliated in Egypt, they went to the Central Africa in order to, and part of the East Africa in order to divert the waters of the Nile. Why? Because the waters of the Nile emanates from Lake Victoria. So what happened when the British realized that the French wanted to divert the waters of the Nile or control the waters of the Nile, they ran very fast to acquire Uganda. And they could not acquire Uganda by moving from Egypt to Uganda. The shortest route was to come through Kenya, then to Uganda. So they came, declared Kenya as their protectorate, rushed to Uganda to acquire Uganda. Why? Because Lake Victoria is in Uganda, the source of River Nile. And in so doing, they moved upwards again to acquire Sudan, because again, the Nile passes Sudan to Egypt. And that is how the British colonized Egypt, Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. So we have already talked about the French activities in West and the Congo, the large acquisition of resources in these territories, alarmed the other European nations who now also developed interest in Africa. In a nutshell, class, we have talked about factors that, of course, we have these other individual initiatives you will get in my notes, people like Cecil Rhodes, who claimed Africa from South Africa to North Africa. So you will get such people in my notes. We've looked at the factors, the motivation of European colonization of Africa. But apart from this, class, the climax of all this that we just discussed was the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 that was called by Otto von Bismarck. And because of the rush that took place, we said that there was need for these European countries to come to Africa, for them to now, for them to sit down and share amongst themselves this bread known as Africa. And in so doing, these countries that participated in the Berlin Conference from November 1884 to February 1885 were Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Portugal, and Spain. So they sat down, agreed, and therefore this led to what we call the terms of the treaty. And these were the terms of the treaty. The agreement, so we are looking at the agreement that was reached upon by these countries in what we call the Berlin Conference. One was that any European nation wishing to establish a claim to any territory in Africa was supposed to inform the other countries. So for example, if Britain developed interest in Egypt, it was supposed to inform other European countries that have developed interest in Egypt, please don't come and also claim the same. Another agreement was that these European countries that had now taken or claimed possession of any territory in Africa, this claim was supposed to be followed by what we call effective occupation of the area by sending the administrators. For example, the British, when they developed interest in Africa, in Kenya, they had to immediately send the administrators or the trading companies to take charge. Another agreement was that we had those major rivers in Africa that were declared free for navigation, that apart from claiming those territories in Africa or areas of or spheres of influence in Africa, those major rivers were declared to be free for navigation. These rivers included Congo and the Niger. So any European country was supposed to use such major rivers for navigation purposes. Apart from this, we are also saying that the European countries, all of them agreed that Congo Free State be given to King Leopold II of Belgians, among others. So that was what we call the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885. And we are saying that this is what led to partition of Africa. And this partitioning is what now brought about the colonization of Africa. Because immediately after the European colonization, the partitioning of Africa, after these European countries had declared different parts of Africa as their spheres of influence, they put demarcations. They began demarcating different parts, putting boundaries to show their spheres of influence. And we are saying that this is what led to the development of nation states in Africa. From what we learned in our previous lesson, of course, we learned about the original development of nation states in Africa. And we just mentioned about the colonization process, that nation states came about after or during the colonization period. Because what happened when these European countries claimed different parts of Africa, they began putting the boundaries, yes, to demarcate their spheres of influence. And therefore, thereby coming up with what we call the nation states in Africa. So up to that point, class, we are saying that having declared different parts of Africa as their spheres of influence, they now changed and called them their colonies. In these colonies, what happened was the establishment of the British rule, the establishment of European rule. For example, those ones that were under the British were able to now establish the British rule. For those ones that were colonized by the French were able to establish their own rule, administrative rule in those colonies. For example, in Senegal, the British were in Kenya, they were in Uganda, they were in South Africa, they were in Egypt. So these European countries established their rule in different parts or in their colonies. Now, this establishment of colonial rule in Africa is now what led to extraction of resources. Now, of course, now the colonization process began to take place. For example, during the colonial period, we are saying these people interfered with them. The first thing was to interfere with the traditional leadership that existed, so that they now they can now establish their own administrative structures. For example, we are saying the leaders in Kenya, we can give a good example of Kenya. Those ones who tried to resist were conquered and their territories taken over. A good example is that the Nandi, the Agriama, they were taken over. For those ones that collaborated, for example, the Wanga here, what happened is that they removed those leaders, or they just made them the paramount leaders. But of course, they put in place their own administrators. These administrators were majorly put there to fast track the colonization process, to ensure that resources are being mined. Yes, resources are being shipped to Europe. So they destroyed the administrative structures, the traditional administrative structures that were there. They established what we call the White Highlands, for example, in Kenya. The fertile lands in KUC, and majorly in central province, or in central Kenya, those regions that were very fertile were taken over and declared as White Highlands. And the Africans were now pushed to reserves, to those areas that were not fertile. So there was this kind of displacement. Now, in the areas where they established the White Highlands, the Africans were recruited to go and work on those farms. Now, Africans were not just requested. There came about what we call forced labor. In the establishment of European rule in Africa, what happened was that these Europeans therefore forced Africans, and therefore introduced what we call forced labor to Africans. Africans were forced to go and work on these White Highlands. Apart from this, they introduced taxes. Africans were supposed to pay tax. They were supposed to pay hard tax. They were also supposed to pay, in fact, to some extent class, something that was fun was about the breast tax, that Africans were expected to pay the breast tax. For those young girls whose breasts were started protruding, began paying taxes, you can imagine. So that is how extent the brutal the European administration was, forcing Africans, giving them low wages on their farms, forcing them to pay tax, and forcing them to provide forced labor on those farms. Apart from that, the movement of Africans was curtailed. They introduced what we call the Kipande system, where if you are an African working on the European farm, there was that special Kipande that they used to wear around their neck. And this one showed your name and the farm that you are supposed to work on. So if you are found just roaming around, you'll be jailed or taken back, and therefore you still pay some fees for having found just roaming around. So Africa, with the establishment of colonial administration in Africa, Africans really went through a lot, because apart from this, apart from whatever we have just mentioned, there was a lot of segregation. For example, we had those special schools for the whites. Yes, Africans just went to very simple schools. They were given just the basics, reading and writing only. Yes, so we had segregation based on color. Even in hospitals, there were those special hospitals for the whites. There were those other ordinary hospitals for the Africans. But we're also saying that just apart from the negative impact, we had also the positive impacts. So that one has led me to look at the impact of European colonization of Africa, and these impacts can be classified or categorized into social, political, and economic impacts. Just to mention by highlighting the social impacts. So when you talk about an impact or an effect, we are looking at the outcome, the consequence of European colonization of Africa. What happened when the Europeans colonized Africa and later on now established their administrative structures? One is that there was cultural disruption. Yes, that the European imposed their cultures and values, disrupting the indigenous African cultures and traditions. And this one often leading to loss of identity and cultural erosion. So that one is still ongoing. that Europeans are still disrupting the cultural aspect of the Africans by introducing their own culture, which was said to be superior. Apart from this, there was population displacement. I've told you about the disposition of significant population or displacement, pushing Africans into African reserves and taking over their fertile land. There was also education changes. They introduced, for example, schools where Africans were taught. But apart from this, there was education divide, special education for the Europeans and the basics for the Africans. Economic impact, we had resource exploitation, which was the major one, because the major reason for the coming of the Europeans was to exploit resources in Africa. So there was resource exploitation in Africa. Important minerals like gold, diamond, copper were taken from Africa and shipped to Europe. There was labor exploitation, whereby Africans were forced to provide forced labor. And apart from this, they were paid low wages on these farms. There was trade imbalance. You cannot really compare the kind of trade that happened in Africa and in Europe. There was this kind of disparity that took place. But there was also what we call infrastructural development. And this infrastructural development was just meant for colonial benefit. Look at, for example, the construction of the Kenya-Uganda Railway. Basically, the Kenya-Uganda Railway was constructed to help the colonialists move to Uganda, ferry the resources from Uganda to the port that is in Mombasa. So the building of roads, the building of railways was not aimed to benefit the Africans, but it was aimed to benefit the Europeans. There was border redefinition we've just talked about, affecting the pre-colonial nations that existed, and therefore creating what we call the modern nation states with diverse populations, like what we see in Kenya. About over 42 tribes were put, pre-colonial nations were put together to form one nation state. And therefore we have diverse populations. You find the Abaluya, the Agikuyu put together to form one nation state. There was imposition of governance structures. We've just talked about those, the European administrative structures that were put in place, and therefore totally destroyed the structures that existed before their coming. There was political fragmentation. We just talked about that. And then the legacy of colonial rule. The legacy of colonial rule continues to influence African politics, with post-colonial governments often grappling with the effects of colonial legacies, including ethnic tensions and governance challenges. So basically, that is what we have learned class today. We began by, of course, laying the background to European colonization of Africa. By laying the background to European colonization of Africa, entirely what happened in Europe that necessitated European colonization of Africa. Then we were able to look at the motivations, the reasons that made the Europeans to come to Africa, which can be classified as economic, social, and political. And the climax of that is what we just looked at, the Berlin Conference and its terms. And after that, we've looked at the European now colonization of Africa, the establishment of European administration or colonial administration in Africa, and the results of this kind of colonization that took place in Africa. At times, you can also look at class, you can look at the positive impacts and the negative impacts. We've just looked at impacts in general, but you can also look at the positive impacts and the negative impacts. we cannot really blame the Europeans that when they were in Africa, there is nothing they did in Africa, or they did very little to Africans. No, there are some aspects that today we can still refer to them as a legacy of the colonialists. Look at the Kenya-Uganda railway. The Kenyan government, and after attaining independence, we've done little to develop such transport system that was established by the colonialists. So this is also a legacy of the European colonization of Africa. Look at the kind of education that we have today. Yes, it was started, the reading and the writing skills was done by the Europeans. Look at very important schools today. Schools were, most of the big schools in Kenya, leading national schools were constructed by the missionaries and the colonialists. Look at the hospitals today. We even have also what we call the mission hospitals. So we cannot really blame Europeans wholesomely that there is nothing they did to Africans. But a good student will critically analyze the colonization process and look at the positive side of the colonists or the colonial administration. Then also look at the negative. We have the negative impact, like for example, the exploitation of African resources, taking wholesomely the African resources to Europe and so on. So class, that marks the end of our class today. And I wish to also get response from you. You have an observation to make, a further contribution to what we've learned. It is welcome. You have a question, you are also welcome. So you can unmute. I've enabled, you can unmute, then you speak up, please. An observation, clarification, you are welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, you are welcome. You're welcome. Hello.
Actually, I've enjoyed that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Classmate is Maasi copy.
When are we having our cut?
Oh yeah, there is the issue of the cut. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. Kindly, you can. I'll give way forward on that about the cut. I'll give way forward on the cut.
Thank you.
This note of yours is good.
Yes.
Yes. This note of yours is good.
Excuse me, sir.
Can you share the note on the LMS?
They are there already. I'll just enable topic 3. We already have topic 1 and 2.
Mimi wacha tu niende notes zangu za
Just confirm that you have topic 1 and topic 3.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Hello.
Yes.
Hapa hivi historians wanaenjoy kwa.
Someone had a concern. Hello, class. You only unmute when you have something to share with the class. Hello? Somebody had a question? Okay.
I was asking on this part of the rise of nationalism.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Somebody was asking about an issue on nationalism. Hello. Hello. Somebody was asking a question on nationalism.
Yes.
Yes.
On this part of the rise of nationalism, this point on Egyptian question
Yes.
that you can illustrate more because I could not understand there.
Or the Egyptian question.
Yes.
So we are looking at Egypt as one of the key factors that necessitated the European colonization of Africa. And basically, class, we call it a question because the European countries had really developed interest in Egypt. The reason was that Egypt was very strategic. When I talk like this, you ought to be having that map of Africa in your mind. That Egypt was very strategic to the British and even to the French, for those European countries that had developed interest to the Far East. That is one. How was it strategic? We said that the easiest route from Europe to the Far East was via the Middle East. But that route had been blocked by the Turkish government. And these people were so fierce to the European nations that they could not dare go by that route. And this explains why, class, for example, before the coming of the colonialists, we had people like Vasco da Gama from all the way from Europe. They sailed around Africa. They went to West Africa, South Africa, East Africa. That is how they now found a sea route to India. And somebody could ask, was it just a venture? No. The shortcut from Europe to Far East, the Asian land or continent, had been blocked by the Turks, who were very fierce. And the Europeans feared them. So the only way was to navigate around Africa. But you see, we had this shortcut, not to cross the Middle East, to face the Turks. The only way was now to come to Africa and go to the Far East. And Egypt enabled that because they had the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is just a landmass that enables one to cross from Africa to the Far East. And the first people to develop interest in Egypt were the French. In fact, they had started, they began by investing in the construction of the Suez Canal. But because of this king, the then King Hadif Ismail, who squandered money that was being contributed towards the same, the British came in strongly to finance the building of the Suez Canal. And after that, because Hadif Ismail was unable to repay, the British strongly took over and replaced and overthrew the French, who had also developed interest and had started contributing towards the building of the Suez Canal. For this reason, class, when the British overthrew the French in Egypt, the French ran, you know, when you talk about class, when you talk about Egypt, you talk of the Nile, because Egypt is in the desert. And for you to govern Egypt, you must control the waters, that is the River Nile. So for the French to revenge against the British, they rushed towards coming to Sudan and to Uganda so that they can take control of the waters of the Nile. You know, once you take control of the waters of the Nile, then you are controlling Egypt. For that matter, class, I said, it is what now necessitated the British to come to East Africa to colonize Uganda and take control. Because by controlling the waters of the Nile, you are controlling Egypt. How were they supposed to enter Uganda? The passage was through the East Coast, that is in Kenya, then you go to Uganda. So this made the British, having controlled Egypt, to come to East Africa enter Uganda, but through Kenya. So they colonized Kenya. They entered into Uganda to control the waters of the Nile. The Nile comes from, the source is Lake Victoria, which was, the source was discovered by John Speak. I hope you know that. So they were able now to colonize Uganda, thereby controlling the waters of the Nile. And because the Nile passes through Sudan, they went northwards to also colonize Sudan. And so we are just looking at the factors that led to European colonization of Africa. And we are just giving a scenario of how now a number of factors led to the colonization of Africa. And one of the concern or factor was the Egyptian question. So by colonizing Egypt, they were able to colonize Sudan, Uganda, and Kenya. And having colonized now Egypt, they now access the Far East via Egypt. I think that is the much I can say about the Egyptian question, class. I hope, is it okay to whoever raised that question?
Yeah,
How the
okay.
Egyptian question came in now to bring about the colonization of Africa.
Yeah,
Very
it's
true.
okay.
Thank you so much, class. So that marks the end of our topic number 3 about European colonization of Africa and its impact to Africa. And because now this one forms a stage for us to begin the next lesson, which is African nationalism. When you talk about African nationalism, we are talking about the quest for being independent, attaining independence, because now Africans were being colonized by the Europeans. So what happened was that these Europeans, these Africans, having experienced the kind of humiliation during the colonial rule, there was this wave, there was this spirit of nationalism that developed in Africans, the quest to attain independence. This is what we refer to as nationalism. So we shall look at the nationalism and how it led to African countries attaining independence. And after that, after attaining independence, we ask now ourselves, what led to the failure of nationalism? Because again, it is this nationalism that led about independence in African countries attaining independence. But immediately after attaining independence, are we independent? That is why somebody like Oginga Odinga in 1966 wrote a book, Not Yet Uhuru. Yes, Kenyans attained independence in 1963, but up to 1966, were we independent? And even up to date, class, are we independent? And that is why we shall look at nationalism today. Are we independent? And there is a subsection under that African nationalism known as failed states in Africa. Failed states, the rise of failed states in Africa. Do we have failed states in Africa? That's a good question we have to ask ourselves. And we shall be looking at some of the features of a failed state. And for us to set the stage for the next lesson, class, just as we did last time, and I'm very happy for those guys who were able to do research. They presented about Walter Rodney's argument on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And you've seen from Walter Rodney's argument, you've seen how some of the factors that we've just mentioned, they revolve around the colonial legacies. Yes. And I'm really very happy by your presentation. So remember, we say that student presentation will also make part of our learning in this course. So I want to request that somebody you can do on, at least you have to say something. So I want somebody to do something on definition of nationalism. What is nationalism? One. Another one will do something on African nationalism, then define, we have already, you look at definition of nationalism, that is one. But now when you talk of African nationalism, what is African nationalism? So another student can take up that one. And then look at the factors that were behind African nationalism. What were these factors that led to African nationalism? They're there on our Google, on media, on Google. You just Google, you get so many points. Factors that led to African nationalism. You can mention them. You can also look at some of the people, the nationalists, key nationalists in Africa. Yes, that is another area. I'm just mentioning some of the areas that you as a student can look at so that as we come in our next session, you should be able to at least say something and contribute towards the learning of our next lesson. So I've talked of definition of the term nationalism, definition of the term African nationalism. Look at the factors that led to African nationalism. Look at key individuals or figures or the ones that we call African nationalists. You can give good examples of these people. And then after that, we shall look at failure of nationalism. Yes, and specifically we shall look at failed state. So what is a failed state? What are the features of a failed nation or a failed state? So look at the features of failed states in Africa. And after that, we shall look at the future of Africa, the future of Africa, the future of Africa. So I think that is in order, class. I've already set stage for our next session, what we shall learn in our next lesson. Please do some research on what I've just told you so that you get prepared for our next session. I'm thinking that class, after our next session, that is topic 4 on African nationalism, we shall have a cut. We shall have a cut. Let me see when we can have a cut. In one of our sessions, this end of October, we shall have a cut, online cut. We shall have an online cut. Go to your calendar, please. If you have a calendar, if you have your calendar on. Yes. On November 1st, we shall have a cut. November 1st, it will be an online cut. The first cut, we shall have 2 cuts. Both of them will be online. And it will be out of, we shall do 30. It will be 30, and then the second cut will also be 30, and then we do average. So on 1st of November, we shall do our cut, online cut. And this cut will cover topic 1, topic 2, topic 3, topic 4, up to nationalism, the topic that we shall cover next week. So get prepared, alert other members that we shall have a cut on 1st of November. It will be on Wednesday. It will be an online cut, 30 marks. So that one will be our cut 1. Then we shall have another one end of November from topic 5 to topic 8. Then we shall do an average of the 2 cuts. That one will form our cut mark. When you fail to do cut 1 or cut 2, what happens is that the marks that you score, we shall not be able to rate you because you have to do the 2 cuts. So for those ones who will fail to do the cut 1 and cut 2, just be very sure that we shall not be able to rate you. So I want to request that cut 1 and cut 2 is compulsory, and cut 1 will cover topic 1 up to topic 4, Then Cat 2 will cover topic 5 to topic 8. Please do necessary arrangement to do that. So in our next session, class, after topic number 4, I'll give the rest of the topics, that is topic 5, 6, 7, and 8, to various groups on board. I know we have the EDA group, we have the BCO, we have the SMA, BCR, those groups. I'll be able to assign you those topics and you will present. So I've done topic 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'll do topic 4 next week. And after topic 4, the rest of the topics will be done by students and we shall have class, of course, presentations. So if you have anything to say, please, you can unmute. I've enabled that you unmute, then speak up, please.
LMS naona topic 1 peke yake.
There is topic 2, and I want to enable topic 3 also. So I'll enable topic 3 after this session. An observation, I hope I'm clear on our cut, which will be done on first.
About
Yes.
Play by TF Hard, FM mode,
Hello.
Bluetooth mode.
I'm requesting those representatives for various groups, the EDA, the SMA, the BCO, please, you can reach out to me. I'm located in ABB 109. Please, you can come around. You can come around for class assignment. I'll give you to present. That is topic 5, 6, 7, and 8. So the class representatives, you come around for the assignment. As we prepare for
What about
online cuts on 1st of November. No? No class, is that okay?
Yes, it is okay.
Okay, thank you. Please, the group representatives announce to members that we shall have the online cut. That is very important.
Thank you for the information, sir.
Okay. I wish now to end the session. Okay.
Bye, sir. Enjoy your lunch.
Bye.
Bye and enjoy your lunch. Hey, watu wa history wamefurahia huku bwana.
Hey, watu wa geography bana kidogo kidurambe.
Nini hiyo kiwarambe?
Hey.
Wewe bwana mtoke online. Mwacheza
Señor Mozo,
Rudy, mlete.
Wewe yakaranga numungaini gobaba. Akate kuka kasana kalisi yangu. Wana kore to tara iko tara kangusi ambe.
Akobo.
Yani monyora gongwa na mas. Na mzinje ngo.
Hizi ni kogoro wasali.
Ojolia kangon gibe sasa.
Otara.
Azenga tu buat misima. Ibu ulikuwa nyama de matraso kan biara ma misima ne
Money
mamchiwa
class.
mo. Aja konting antu mere gibe sang mungire mji nkokolera side men mungire mji. Ajikubodi abantu kiro monda wantinga nabo. Bonga boli kiro monda wate misima.
Niko kara nagenda kama
Kamuata giyo kanga matingio minute boys.
Tanya peso change.
Kaboli boys gete kama konting ogo posins gete bo.
Uno change to jo.
Dia go chimot. Kama kumonjo keranga moteo taro madna agyo. Bintang era sini itu
Nah, bintang aku ada estimate director.
Video
Nah,
korai
aku makin macam mana?
Kamu aja jaga konten sih kamu ya. Biasa bang nunggu.
Hey, masaa lunch bana na hakuna pesa.
Unataka nikubebe?
Kaka unasikia huyu ati unaona hapo kwa group. Sikia. Alikuwa kilia. Nataka nikubebe. Zidi mtata mkuu analia. Alisahau akanini akaacha kama baada hajatoka class. Jana kuja huko kwa nyumba kama ukwenda ukienda na jioni. Nimeona kupata. Ndio bado kuna bibi. Ile ndio yake wameweka. Ndio pia na kitu simu ametoka.